Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're going to dig into a really fascinating framework called the Upsilon Factor. It's all about trying to build a system for making those big, messy societal decisions, but without getting bogged down in traditional and, let's face it, often conflicting ideas of morality. So let's get right to the heart of the problem, right? We all have these deeply held, personal beliefs about what's right and what's wrong. But the second we try to make rules for everyone, those subjective moral codes clash, and we end up in total gridlock. So how are you supposed to build a society that works for everybody when you can't even agree on the starting point? And this quote from the author Isvahl Inaj just nails it. The argument is that when we start with these rigid, unprovable statements, think "thou shalt not kill," we're actually making it harder to agree. Because those rules immediately start to crumble when you hit complex situations like, say, self-defense or tricky medical ethics. The Upsilon Factor says there's got to be a better way.
Okay, so how does this whole thing actually work? Well, here's our game plan. First, we're going to get a handle on this core idea of making decisions without dogma. Then, we'll look at the two super simple assumptions it's all built on. From there, we'll see how it measures suffering and joy, which leads us to something called the snowball framework. And finally, we'll see the Upsilon Factor itself in action as a kind of consensus engine.
So the first big idea here is this. We have to stop trying to build society based on these big, clunky, prepackaged moral sentences. The proposal is to break everything down, way down, to the most basic shared components of belief, the finest granules, you could say, and build up from there. Okay, and this analogy from the book is just brilliant. You got to hear this. Imagine you're writing a book. If you're only allowed to use entire sentences that already exist, well, your book's going to be super rigid and pretty limited. Now, if you can use individual words, that's way more flexible. But if you can use the letters themselves, you can create literally anything. The point is, to get the best, most agreeable result, you have to work with the smallest, most fundamental building blocks.
All right, so if we're not starting with big moral rules, where do we start? What are those fundamental letters we're talking about? Well, the framework says we only need two core assumptions, the absolute bare minimum, the author argues, for any kind of cooperation to even be possible.
And here they are. It's actually super simple. First, we exist. The universe is real, we're real. Yeah, pretty hard to argue with that one if you're listening to this. Second, logic works, that we can reason together using the same rules and actually get to a shared conclusion. That's it. These are the two non-negotiable starting points, the absolute bedrock of the whole system.
Okay, so we've got our bedrock. We exist, and logic works. Now, the framework introduces its currency, its way of measuring the outcomes of any decision. And it's not good or bad. Instead, it asks a simple question. Does this action increase or decrease the total amount of suffering and joy in the universe?
Okay, and this is absolutely the key idea. The system doesn't try to objectively measure suffering, because that's impossible, right? Instead, it measures something we can observe and feel, our own empathetic response to suffering. This is called empathy-weighted suffering, or EWS. It's the total concern that anyone feels, and, naturally, our own suffering feels the heaviest in that personal calculation.
And this is such a great way to think about it. You've got the direct suffering, the actual pain a person or creature feels, but then you have the empathetic suffering, that vicarious pain we feel when we see it happen. You know, that wince you get when you see someone fall? The Upsilon framework argues that it's this measurable biological response, our empathetic pain, that's what really drives our decisions, and that's what we can use to find agreement. So, how do all these pieces fit together? Well, now we get to the core of the decision-making process. The author lays it all out in a four-part hierarchy called the snowball. It basically prioritizes our actions based on our most fundamental observable drives.
And the hierarchy is super clear. Priority number 1, omega, is just avoiding a level of suffering so bad that you lose the will to live. Simple. Priority 2, alpha, is keeping just enough personal joy to want to survive in the first place. Okay, once those two survival needs are met, then we get to number 3, upsilon, the drive to minimize the total empathetic suffering we feel for everyone. And only last, and number 4, do we get to zeta, which is all about maximizing our own personal joy.
So, let's break that down. Omega and alpha, that's just basic survival. Zeta, that's you trying to live your best life. But that third one, upsilon, that's the magic ingredient. That is the engine for getting us all on the same page. So, let's see how this thing actually works with a little thought experiment from the book.
Okay, so picture this tiny universe. Just 3 people, Larry, Mary, and Nancy, and 5 crabs. Now here's the dilemma. These crabs can be consumed, but doing so has 2 effects. It causes the crab to suffer, but it can also cure a rare form of blindness that causes a ton of human suffering. So you've got a direct trade-off right there.
All right, first up, the easy case. What if someone just wants to cook and eat a crab because, it tastes good? Let's say, for argument's sake, this gives the human 10 units of joy, but causes the crab 100 units of suffering. From the outside, that seems like a pretty bad trade, but how does the Upsilon factor calculate it from a specific person's point of view?
Well, when Larry, one of the people in this little world, actually runs the numbers from his perspective, the result is a net increase of 6 units of total suffering. You see, he feels some empathy for the crab's pain. He even accounts for the empathetic pain his friends might feel. And when you weigh all that against the tiny bit of joy someone gets, the math just says, nope, bad trade.
Okay, but now let's make it a lot harder. What if Mary is blind, and this blindness causes her, let's say, 33 units of constant suffering? Now, consuming a crab will completely cure her, getting rid of that suffering, but it's still going to cause that crab 100 units of pain.
From Mary's own perspective, this is a total no-brainer. Her own suffering is by far the biggest factor in her personal calculation. So wiping out 33 units of her own daily pain, even while feeling empathy for the crab, it results in a massive net reduction of 32 units of suffering in her world. For her, it's a huge, obvious win.
But, and this is where it all comes together, here's the conflict. When Larry runs the same numbers, he gets a totally different answer. His personal empathy calculation, where he maybe has lower empathy for Mary's specific condition and higher empathy for the crab, results in a net increase of 1.2 units of suffering. So what's a clear win for Mary is actually a net loss for Larry. And this is exactly where those old-school moral arguments just fall apart.
So instead of screaming at each other about who's right, the Upsilon factor gives them a tool, a way to negotiate. It forces everyone to make their subjective empathy weights explicit and measurable. You calculate the outcome from everybody's point of view, and then you find a path to an agreement, maybe by using an average empathy weight for the whole group. It turns a moral fight into a shared math problem you can solve together.
And that's really the whole point, you see. This framework isn't about finding some magical, universal truth. It's about engineering a system that gives us the best possible chance of agreeing by relying as little as possible on unprovable beliefs. It's grounded in something we can actually observe and measure, the biology of our own empathy.
And that's the big question this whole idea leaves us with, isn't it? What if the real key to building more cooperative, less conflicted societies isn't about getting everyone to believe in the same values, but about building systems that acknowledge, calculate, and optimize for the empathy that we already have? It's a huge shift from debating morality to actually engineering consensus.